Welcome, everyone, to today's show. I'm JJ Flazanes, your host and producer. Thank you for downloading today's episode. Today we have Dr. Nasha Winters with us. We're going to talk about healing into dying. It is her personal story about her death experience, or her going into a death experience and not resisting it, but thinking that she was going to learn along the way about how to heal herself to the best of her ability while she was dying, because she actually wanted to die. One of the great things about today's show is the mind, body, soul aspect that I wasn't aware was going to happen when we started the conversation, and the depth at which we took that conversation. And because of that, today is part one of 3 parts that we're going to have with Dr. Nasha, because we didn't even get into the meat of the things I really wanted to talk about, because her story was so fascinating and included so many things about the emotional components to attracting and manifesting cancer, and the emotional components that will hurt you if you've healed, let's just say physically, but you haven't healed mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. So with that said, in the theme of manifestation, attraction, law of attraction, and emotion, I just want to remind everybody in the community that we have one more free 30-day manifestation challenge happening in September 2020. I don't know a better time for us to be very specific and focused on how we want our energy to flow, what frequency we want to be on right now, and how we can deliberately choose that and commit to that and create positive momentum for ourselves as well as the planet. If you're interested in joining us for the last free 30-day manifestation challenge, go to jjflazanes.com/30-day. That is 30DAY. You must be registered. You will get a link to the Facebook group, and then I'll ask a few questions to verify your email address. If you do not have an email address that matches, or if you haven't filled that out, you may not get in. I am very, very tight on the security side of making sure that the people in that group are people like you who listen to the show. So that way we have a very well established, close community of understanding these tools and principles. So that way when we're in the group, that it flows and everyone can be supportive of each other at the level in which you would expect by listening to the show. So again, that's jjflazanes.com/30-day, 30DAY, and the link will be in the show notes. Dr. Nasha Winters is a sought-after luminary and global healthcare authority in integrative cancer research. She consults with physicians around the world, bridging ancient therapies with advancements in modern medicine in the digital era. A personal journey with cancer and a medical career spanning over 25 years has Dr. Nasha on a mission to educate and empower the nearly 50% of the population expected to have cancer in their lifetime. Welcome to the show, Dr. Nasha.
Hi, JJ. Thank you for having me.
Well, I love when I learn things I didn't know before. And of course, we all don't know everything, right? So there's always room to learn more. And one of the things I love about your book, The Metabolic Approach to Cancer, was that besides the fact that it's so thick and like an anthology, like I feel like it's the only book on cancer you're probably going to need for a long time, whether you have cancer or not. Like I have this trust in this book right now that, if anyone I ever know gets cancer, I can come here. I do have other books and other books that you even reference in your references, like Suzanne Summers' Knockout, right? Or Suzanne Summers' Breakthrough. And I want to talk about so many different things that I learned in your book and things that you talk about. But before we get into all of my I can't wait to talk about that and that and that. I want to go over your story of like how you got here and why you wrote a book about the metabolic approach to cancer. Because I know you have your own cancer story, right?
Right. I mean, I don't really know anybody who's gotten into the cancer arena without having an up close and personal experience with it. So I'm no different than the rest of my tribe.
Well, let's start there. Let's start with a little bit of your background into, things that we didn't hear from your bio, and then into your experience, and then what culminated is you writing a book about the metabolic approach to cancer.
Sure. I was just kind of came into this world with a lot of crazy health issues from the get-go. I feel terrible for, my mom putting up with some of my health issues as a kid, a lot of colic, a lot of GI stuff. And so really, I never really even understood the concept of wellness because I'd been sort of sick from the get-go for so long that I didn't even understand that I was sick, if that makes sense. It's that analogy we hear of, putting the live lobster into a cold pot of water and slowly heating it. I was that lobster, right? Until the lobster water was boiling. And so was I. Up until that point, it took years to get to that point. And so fast forward, all of my crazy health issues at a very young age, but right between, the junction of turning age 19 into 20, my sophomore year of college, in and out of the hospital and ER for the year prior to the official diagnosis, everyone thought I was just dealing with some of my old chronic health issues, polycystic ovarian syndrome, endometriosis, IBS, like all of these things kind of looked and smelled the way they had for all the years prior. By the time I did finally land in the hospital with a full belly full of fluid, cancerous fluid, a concept known as ascites, my organs had decided to completely shut down. My pulse ox was super low. I mean, I was really in trouble. That's when they kind of went, oh, she's not a hypochondriac. Oh, she's not dealing with, ongoing polycystic ovarian issues. That's when they did a full workup and realized that I was an end-stage organ failure, secondary to stage 4 ovarian cancer. So I still say that, and it still kind of freaks me out because that's almost 29 years ago. It'll be 29 years this October. And I was so sick that there was nothing they could offer. I mean, they knew that a single dose of chemotherapy would just wipe out what little, kind of kidney and liver function I still had remaining. So that wasn't a recommendation. The recommendation was, you can get another opinion, but they'll probably tell you the same, which they did. And we can start treatment, but even with treatment, we're looking at a couple of months at best. So basically, the good old get your affairs in order story came my way. Bit of a shock on one level. And people who've listened to me share my story before, the other level is it wasn't a shock at all. Because honestly, I had been praying for a very long time to end a lot of the misery of my life, and had even tried to take my own life over the years. And so for me, the gift of that moment was the realization that I really did want to live. And that's what has begun a near 3-decade journey ever since.
Well, you don't look a day over 30. So the fact that this was 29 years ago, you were pretty young. Yeah. And so before that, I'm guessing you weren't a naturopath.
No, I was an undergrad at the time of my diagnosis. I was a CNA. I worked as a certified nursing assistant at my local nursing home. I worked on an Alzheimer's unit and around the rest of the facility. I was also a CAC 1 and 2, which is a certified addictions counselor by the state of Colorado. I worked in a detox center, addictions. I actually thought I wanted to be a psychotherapist working with addictions, thanks to my background. And I also was pre-med. I was also still very interested in medicine. I was a biology, chemistry major. But leading up to that, I always had a natural kind of curiosity of the world, a love of medicine, a love of the sciences, a love of the natural world. So this wasn't, that far off for me. When I was given that diagnosis, being a student and being into my second year of college, I didn't expect to live. That was not what I was shooting for. My whole goal wasn't about, I'm going to kick this cancer. I didn't have any of that inner fight battle mentality. My role or my road that I took was one of curiosity, one of saying, okay, if I'm going to leave this world, I want to understand all of the components that led to this moment. I want to really understand this for myself so I can make peace with it and basically heal into dying. That was sort of this weird 19, almost 20-year-old mindset that I was dealing with of, okay, I always wanted to die and now I don't, but now I'm going to. So I want to understand more of my story. And frankly, that is what I've helped well over 10,000 people do in the past nearly 3 decades, do the same.
So what was the first step after the diagnosis in terms of, okay, I want to understand, I'm curious, I do want to live. Now what am I doing physically?
Perfect. So there's kind of 2 main things that happen simultaneously. 3. Number 1, I somehow recognized in some form or fashion that what was going on with me came from deep-seated trauma. Okay, so I know you've recently had Dr. Bruce Lipton. He was actually one of the first people I stumbled upon his work, and Candace Pert and other people in my research. So I deeply intuitively connected with the concept of psychoneuroimmunology and the concept of trauma and ideologies, belief systems impacting my disease or health expression. Somehow at the ripe age of 19, 20, I knew that. Something very intuitively inside of me knew that. So there was that piece of, that was one of the things I stumbled upon in my early research. I was also, after my second opinion, I was basically, because I was also uninsured, and I had taken a family fast out of my own self-preservation. Even before my diagnosis, I was moving into that direction. And that meant that I was really led to doing this on my own on all levels. And so I immediately went to the library after I was told there's nothing we can do. And a book sort of jumped off the shelf at me called Quantum Healing by Deepak Chopra, which back in 1991, that was kind of no one knew about that, especially this kid from Kansas, who grew up in a very kind of conservative Christian environment of not knowing, other thought processes out there. This was a very eye-opening book for me. And I actually inhaled it in about 2 hours on the library floor and had my own paradigm shift in and of that moment. And then third piece that was happening within a matter of weeks of this was I was my student loan component was also working a work grant piece. I was working in our library, my small 4-year liberal arts school. And because it was a small, not well-funded little liberal arts school, we also had a lot of outdated textbooks. That actually probably saved my life, because one of the textbooks I ran across with regards to cancer was some of the early work by a Dr. Otto Warburg. And this is a man from the 1920s that later won a Nobel Prize for his work understanding cancer as a metabolic disease, starting at the level of our mitochondria. And that resonated with me far more than the two-hit theory of cancer, the genetic theory of cancer that I was starting to learn in all my science classes. So these weird things happened simultaneously, frankly, kind of aligned rather miraculously, in my opinion, that led me to take a very different path to my understanding, which then led me to different paths of how I was going to approach this. And then every time I was able to kick the can down the road a little bit further, new information would sort of come to the surface that would help me figure out what was going on and keep on keeping on. So I'm still that person almost 30 years later, learning new things about myself, about this process, about this as a big picture of how it affects everybody. At this point, almost half of us will experience cancer in our lifetime on this planet, that it's just this ongoing life learning, living laboratory that I've become and brought others into the fold to learn as well.
So you've read Quantum Healing, you're looking at the metabolic application of dealing with cancer. So what's the first thing you do on the physical level in terms of, did you do the chemo? Did you do a drastic change in diet? Did you do vitamin C infusions? What did you do?
Good question. So where I was, again, this was a path. This wasn't me making a conscious decision or learning about this. This was just the result of my situation, which was that I also had a bowel obstruction at the time of my diagnosis. So that meant that anything I put in would come back out at the top, including, and this is going to be a bit graphic, stool over a period of time, because my bowel obstruction was pretty bad. Okay. So that was part of what they thought was going to kill me fastest. They thought that I was just going to blow out my colon or just die of malnourishment. But what ended up happening is, when you are at the state of cachexia, metabolic wasting, so a concept where my muscles are breaking down faster than they can build up, as well as the blockage, as well as the nausea and the pain, as well as the fluid that took up valuable real estate in my abdomen that pushed against my diaphragm and my stomach, so there wasn't even room to eat if I wanted to, I accidentally didn't eat and therefore fasted for almost 2 months. Little sips of water, little sips of tea, every once in a while, little sips of broth or different things along the way. But that, now in hindsight, was probably what saved my life, because of the level of research we've now had around the role of fasting in the treatment of cancer and the enhancement of standard of care treatments of cancer. So that was number one. And that was a default, accidental, not thought out. Now I actually guide people to do that on purpose, deeply thought out, deeply researched, deeply vetted. But then I didn't know that. That was number one. Number two, my pain was out of control. So the next thing I did for dealing with my pain management is I found a brand new, relatively new to town at that time, acupuncturist. Very, very big deal back then. No one knew, really acupuncture almost 30 years ago was kind of unheard of or very still on the fringe. Today it's very, it's integrated in almost every major cancer center in the country. But 30 years ago it wasn't, or 29 years ago it wasn't. So I started doing acupuncture to deal with the extreme discomfort of the ascites, the pain, the liver mets, all of the, the pelvic pain that I was having, all of the different stuff. And that weirdly, of course, took care of my pain, but it started to balance out other things. Anyone who's ever experienced acupuncture knows what it has an effect on the rest of your quality of life. So my stress response, my sleep patterns, my digestion. I was actually starting to actually make some movements happen. So it was impacting my peristalsis. It was opening up that blockage. It was taking away the pain. It was allowing me to start to nourish myself again. That was sort of phase two. And I promise you that it has been almost a tiny little drop in the bucket stair step ever since of, okay, well now I have room to maybe bring in some things that I was reading about. Like at that time, Pal Darko tea. Today, we have had some studies to show that Pal Darko tea actually induces apoptosis of ovarian cancer cells, but that data wasn't available back then. It just seemed like a good idea because I was dealing with chronic candida and other health issues, and Pal Darko is kind of what I stumbled across in the old herbal eclectic journals and writings. And so it's been that way for me all along. It's almost like I was led to the next step and the next step and the next step. And I'm still experimenting with myself and others, but I'm also now able to tap into the literature, the research. At that time, there was no Dr. Google. Internet was not available where I was. There was, dependent on microfiche and the Dewey Decimal System to do any form of research. And the limited amount of information there was at that time on how to treat cancer outside of a standard of care, chemo, surgery, radiation model was utilizing things like the Gerson therapy or certain herbal, interventions that were showing up at that time. And I tried those and didn't get great results, but still kept learning and digging and starting to think more critically and mechanistically to, okay, well, what would the mechanism of action be of the acupuncture on this? And that's when I started learning about, wow, it's impacting my endorphin system, which is probably letting my body, have a moment of peace, of release, of relief. And so I was just kind of learning along the way, like, well, that makes sense. Let's follow this a little bit further.
Do you have any idea what your astrological chart is?
It's so funny you asked that because I was such the scientist. I was like, that's all hooey, bogus. It was in 1996 that I was in my first year of medical school, and we had a visiting Ayurvedic doctor teaching some of the old Ayurvedic pieces as a elective course at my college in my naturopathic medical school in Arizona. And this woman, she was an Ayurvedic practitioner, but she utilized in her patient assessments, she utilized this ancient Ayurvedic astrology called Jyotish, Jyotish. And she offered, because we housed her, my husband and I, then boyfriend, lived near the campus. So we put her up, and her thank you to us for having her stay with us was to do a reading for us. And my husband was a biochemist in grad school at ASU learning, drug design, cancer drug design. That was his focus for his PhD. And my work was as a doctor, naturopathic medicine focus in my college. So both of us were still very scientific and thought this was a little weird. This woman who, at this point, you also have to know that I kept my diagnosis pretty much under lock and key. There were only a very handful of people who knew, because I did not associate with being a cancer patient. I did not want to be a cancer patient. Was still not expecting to live a full 5 years into my diagnosis. I was still dealing with it pretty readily. So my student doctors at the college knew, one of my trusted professor advisors knew, of course, my husband knew, and one or two best friends knew. And that was it. Not even my own family knew at that time. They knew later, but they didn't know then. And so part of that was also self-preservation, for a topic we can get onto at another time. But what ended up happening is Marg, this woman, ended up doing my chart. And of course, I knew nothing. And she looks at my chart. She knows nothing about me. And she said, wow. She goes, by all accounts, and I was 25 years old at the time she read this. She said, by all accounts, you shouldn't be here. And I sat there. I'm like, well, what do you mean? She goes, you entered this state called Rahu at age 10. that lasts until you're about 29. But a few years ago, your chart moved into this area that basically is where people die. I mean, like, I'm really simplifying a lot of concepts here, but she's like, this is what, and she literally could say April of 1991. And that's when I started ending up in the ER constantly. She's like, somewhere between April 21st of 1991 and April 21st of 1992, you basically were supposed to die. So what in the world? She's like, have you had any health issues? Like, she's asking me, and I'm just sitting there like the blood going cold in my body thinking, did someone, share my medical history, et cetera. So that was one big aha. And then I've had a few other Western astrologers and other Ayurvedic folks look at my chart and they're like, you came through these things because you have very important work to do on this planet. And the dashas and the things I'm running right now on my chart are very much about teaching, or about speaking out, about going against the system, about changing paradigms. And I laugh because that was definitely not my intention, right? Ever along the way. And yet time and again, people who've met me who come from that perspective, from astrology, psychic, et cetera, they're like, holy shish, like this was definitely meant to be. And so, give or whatever your belief system is, it is pretty compelling when someone can be so accurate about the time frame of your life and give such incredible validation to experiences and processes. And yet, even now, when I seek out this information because it helps give me a little clarity about the chaos around me and in the world, and maybe where we're going, and maybe offers me some light at the end of the tunnel. It's clear that this is precisely what path I was supposed to take.
Well, I don't do astrology to that level. I teach people, I basically use your planetary alignment in several areas to understand how you interpret information, what's important to you, how you hear things, how you value things, how you respond, and how you can communicate and work with others, because not everybody interprets things the same way. And astrology gave me that perspective of, look, if this person is, let's just say an earth sign, and I'm really just going elements now, but earth signs generally want stability. And so they seek the comfort of stability, of knowing their surroundings, of having a box. They want the box. And then the fire signs are like, if you even show me the box, I'm running in the opposite direction as fast as I can. Right. And those are just very basic, right? Very, very basic elemental personality traits. But then when you take it more into your chart, like for instance, you're talking about that you're here for communication. So that's your Mercury, which sounds like your Mercury might be in Sag or Aquarius. I don't know if you know all of that, but if you know, do you know
a little bit? Well, I know. So I'm a Libra, so I am born, sun sign Libra, rising sign Scorpio, moon in Aquarius. I know that much about myself. When people look at my dashas from an Ayurvedic Jyotish, I was born in a Mercury. That was the dasha I was running, born into Mercury, have then moved into, other dashas. Now I'm currently running a Saturn piece, which is not an easy one to be running as well. But these pieces are, Mercury right now it's apparently exalted in the places on my chart. Again, I sound like an idiot. Like I can talk Cancer, but when I start talking things like this, I sound like a bumbling fool. So forgive me.
No. You are repeating what has been said to you, and the things that you're talking about are things that I don't have necessarily familiarity with anyway. Obviously the sun in Libra, moon in Aquarius, rising Scorpio. Do you know what your true node or north node is?
Gosh, somewhere along the way I did. I wish I did right now.
That's okay.
I'm going to come after you after this and find out.
And like so my Mercury is in Aquarius, and one of the things about Mercury in Aquarius is sort of that trendsetter of looking at patterns and helping to heal the world before the world needs it, kind of thing. And it wasn't until I learned that about my Mercury in terms of communication, it made a lot of sense, and it validated sort of my forward thinking and why people think I'm weird, or I felt weird in my family because I would see trends. I was 12 years old telling my family what was going to happen to my cousins, like in years to come. And of course they're looking at me like, you're a crazy kid. And then when they happened, they were like, how did she know that? And I didn't have an answer for how I knew it, except I'm watching a movie. You're in the movie and I'm the observer, and I see the patterns happening, and I see what's going to happen if things don't change. So anyway, so I always ask about, because I can feel the water part of you. And it's so interesting because the Libra part of you, like you said, Like you were looking for, it's almost like you were looking for the universe or God to tell you, should you be living? You're like, oh, I kind of want to die.
Right.
Oh, I've got this disease. I'm going to make peace with it. Like the balanced aspect of Libra going, oh, I'm going to make peace with it. Like, I'm not going to take one position or another. I'm just going to sort of find the balance and the truth of it. And so that's good. So anyway, I needed to know. I didn't need to know. I like to know because I hear things. And for me, it's an ongoing experiment and curiosity in how it gets expressed. And
I love that.
So, all right. So now we have this cancer journey that literally fell upon you, and everything that you did was like, oh, I can't eat, therefore I'm going to fast. And wow, look, that kind of saved my life. What happened when you went back to the doctors? Did you go back to the doctors at some point?
Oh yeah. So at that time, because I was up at the college, we had a health center. So I was going there to I could get basic labs run, and I could get my pelvic ultrasounds. And at that time also I was getting MRIs, which unfortunately after 5 or 6 MRIs in a row, I put myself into kidney failure because of the gadolinium poisoning, which unfortunately to this day is still probably my biggest issue. I mean, the cancer was one thing, but dealing with kind of chronic kidney failure is not a fun journey. So I've got about a 30% and 70% functioning of my kidneys even to this day. And it's really hard for me to clear the gadolinium, no matter how many tries and how many ways and how many brilliant people I know to help me with this. It puts me almost into the hospital if I try to clear it. So I'm very careful and conscious and just know I have to really take care of these puppies, which is very interesting because kidneys are very associated with Libra, by the way, which I learned that later. So the other piece of that is also in Chinese medicine, which is one of my doctorates and interest as well, is kidney is all about total terror, fear.
Yep.
That is the anxiety. And that was what I grew up in. What I survived is what set that sort of tone in this piece. So you kind of, you're taking me kind of on this interesting journey and sharing with your listeners, which I'm hoping they're following along here to some degree, or at least just being present and letting it wash over them. But ultimately, in my monitoring, I was able to start to also run some basic blood tests, and I started learning how to analyze, like you seeing patterns in people. I started seeing patterns in data. And then I started correlating data of the actual physical lab assessments and diagnostic imaging and patterns of where things showed up in the body to patterns of experiences in life and to personalities and to the way people respond in certain ways. So what I was intrigued by you saying of how you use astrology is how I basically collect the story of patients and weave it all together to understand, probably in a bit of a seemingly esoteric way, but all very validated with, very thorough testing. I'm able to help them understand the correlation between, okay, your kidneys aren't working, but here's the terror piece, or your lungs, have some issues, but there's this deep latent grief, or the colon is having issues or like the liver's having issues and there's this deep latent, depression or rage or unresolved, emotions. And so in that time of learning for myself, seeing a Chinese, acupuncturist, herbalist, she started teaching me about these patterns and relationships. And then I started taking courses from a local herbalist who started teaching me about systems, and systems thinking with approach to that. And so before I even started medical school, I worked at a health food store. So because I was super poor, I could get discounted food. I could also take home all the food they were going to throw away. I pretty much lived on throwaway food for several years. I could take home any supplements that were either samples or that people were returning or greatly discounted if they were going to discontinue. So that's how I could afford to do that. I would clean houses of people like my acupuncturist to get treatment because I didn't have the money to pay her, or do yard work or gardening for the Rolfer, who was helping me basically make room in my pelvis because I had so much scarring from the tumor burden in my pelvis and from all the ascites that had stretched everything out. And so I was a freaking resourceful little person with no means to do so. Full on first person in my college to go to college, first person in my family to go to college, working several jobs, taking a huge student loan burden of classes, which should also give folks a kind of a bit of an awareness of my personality, was my survival mode that precisely got me into having a cancer diagnosis was also the the beneficiary of helping me get out of the hot mess. So what had initially caused all that stress and trying to survive also helped me kind of float on top of it for the first good 5 to 10 years. And then I started to realize that that pattern of survival and fear and all those pieces was keeping me from breaking through a certain level. Like, great, I can keep myself alive right now, but I am still sinking. That's like the first decade experiment of my own surviving this process, despite my cancer markers still being well over 1,000. They were in the 15,000s when I was first diagnosed, still seeing things on ultrasounds and MRIs when I was still able to run them, and the one CT scan I had that almost killed me outright because of the scan dye as well. All of these other labs, I started to learn how to listen to my body and correlate the data to what was going on and alter my treatment based on what the data was telling me. And part of that data input was, again, we started with fasting because I couldn't fit it in. But several years leading up to my diagnosis, I had become a vegan because I had grown up in Kansas. My grandma worked for a meat packing company for 50 years before she retired. I was horrified by the state of animal welfare at feedlots and that environment. That's what I was exposed to in my farming, ranching family of origin. And I decided, for animal reasons, for ethics, that I was not going to eat animal flesh. But the caveat was that I thought that Vlasic pickles, Velveeta cheese, which is not cheese, and iceberg lettuce was a good substitute for that. So I became even more malnourished, more inflamed, and messed up my hormones and blood sugar even further by the time I was diagnosed. And instead of learning about that, the beginning, I actually became more dogmatic about my diet. So I stayed into kind of the vegan world the first 7 years of my diagnosis. And it wasn't until my Chinese medicine professor into my second year of medical school said, "You're dying." Like, called me out on it because my pulses, my tongue, everything was in trouble. All my labs were a hot mess. I was so extremely malnourished. And he got me to agree to eating eggs a couple times a week. That was my gateway drug. And that still took me until 2006 before I had any other animal flesh. And not until 2010 did I finally let go of what was really causing so many of my lifelong health patterns, which for me, in my body, my N=1 experiment happened to be legumes and grains, which, as you can imagine, as a vegan and then a vegetarian, was the predominant base camp of my diet. Now, on the side, I had polycystic ovarian syndrome, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, endometriosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and celiac disease. Those are the known autoimmune diagnoses I've also received after my cancer diagnosis, because I kept eating those things into existence. Because what I thought I was doing right for my cancer was actually aggravating all of the other terrain issues in my body. I've since learned a lot about that because I've researched on myself, but I've also learned, as the data is changing, what works and doesn't work for certain conditions, certain epigenetic expressions, certain lab values. And so again, a living laboratory, doing it in real time, making a lot of mistakes along the way, and pivoting as needed as I learned something new.
Well, you actually just hit upon one of the points that I wanted to make sure that we covered today, because as I was looking through your book and reading different parts for different reasons, I got to the little section about the alkaline versus acid conversation. Yeah. And you mentioned Gerson, and that's definitely one of the things that I have heard worked for people. The idea that you're eating a vegetarian/vegan raw food diet, Gerson's one application of that, but yeah. I know that it's based on the whole acid alkaline conversation. And you say in the book that that's actually not true. Can we talk about that?
Absolutely. So if you actually talk to any physiologist, any chemist, there is no such thing as an alkaline diet. Okay. And so this is definitely a myth that's been perpetuated by influencers and well-meaning people. And it's not that they're trying to mislead. It's just that they misunderstood what they're looking at. So basically, what is actually, quote unquote, their thought of an anti-acid or an alkaline-rich diet is actually a diet that is kind of biochemically matched to that person, and anti-inflammatory and deeply nutritious, like deep nourishment. That is kind of the base camp of what it fizzles down to. But here's what's interesting. To change the acid-alkaline balance within our bodies, you have to overcome so many checks and balancing pieces within your physiology, because every single tissue, every organ, every cell, different times of the day, different times of the year, different times of the season, needs different levels of acidity or alkalinity to be metabolically functioning at its optimum. So for instance, you might want to have some things, be alkaline that you're eating, but you have all these things like right down the pipe, hydrochloric acid. You have to have HCl, a very acidic component, to break down your nutrients to absorb your B12. And so if you're eating a vegetarian or vegan diet, first of all, you're not getting B12. Number one. Number two, if you're eating so many foods that are, if you're pushing really hard, you're not getting enough hydrochloric acid. You're kind of spitting that fire out, if you will. So then you're not breaking that down and absorbing into the body. There's all these interesting checks and balances, and you can do it. You can push acidity or alkalinity pharmacologically. You can't really do it from diet and lifestyle. What you can do is when you encourage people to eat a very clean, seasonal, local, and clean meaning organic. I mean, it's so sad that we have to go to such great lengths now to find quality food, but that's just the reality of the world today. If you're eating real food as close to the original source as possible, that's seasonal and local, you are eating in accordance with the nature of your body and the nature around you. That is keeping a lot of balance in every tissue. What tissues need to be acidic will stay acidic. What tissues need to be alkaline will stay alkaline. So it's more of this adaptogenic way of thinking instead of I'm going to eat an alkaline diet. Well, first off, if you ate an alkaline diet, you'd have to take such massive pharmaceuticals to suppress acid in your body that we can actually end up in alkalosis, which is actually very deadly, just as acidosis is very deadly. So we don't ever want to push that pharmacologically even. So I think people just misunderstand. Chris Kresser does a great job explaining the biochemistry of this, as do other influencers and educators and clinicians out there. But I'm always explaining to my patients, like, we're just a teeter-totter and we need different things at different times. And we just really want to focus on the center of the teeter-totter to keep the balance, that homeostasis. And doing so is about just going back to source and keeping it as balanced and holistic as possible.
So that's the Libra in you about learning to find your balance.
Yes,
and then the Aquarius part of you is that futuristic thinker and wanting to bring education. And both of those are air signs, which is about thoughts and ideas. So that is why the data part of this is all very interesting to you, because it's about ideas. And so I can see the culmination of your zone of genius being that you needed to learn balance, and you're learning the balance of all these different ideas that were told to you, and you're literally taking from both sides of Eastern medicine and Western medicine. And you're saying, hey, this may work in this situation, but if we go over here, this works most of the time and helps us to not ever be in a state of crisis or out of balance. And I've been doing acupuncture for 20 years and have had several people on the show. And when you were talking about kidneys, I was like, fear, kidneys is fear. So I'm glad that you brought up, because I always correlate, because in Chinese medicine, as you know, the lungs are about grief. And most people, when they have a death in the family, or they have some kind of bronchitis or some reoccurring lung issue, it's a signal of deep grief that hasn't been released from them. So it doesn't matter. And I think you had a quote from Carolyn Mace in your book that says it doesn't matter what treatment you give someone if the underlying cause is a spiritual and emotional calling for growth and expansion. It doesn't matter what you do, Western, Eastern, because none of it will work if you don't learn the lesson that it sparked in you in terms of your expansion. So I love that, but I had to just point out the Aquarius Libra application in this situation, because it's so clear now, especially knowing. And I love, there are so many people that are vegan that think that, I don't eat animal meat, therefore, and there's so many, and not that they're not incorrect, but there are hormones and antibiotics and things in meats that shouldn't be. And that does add to some of the problems that we have now. But going back to looking at, because I know that one of the things that you recommend, besides deep nutrition, and deep nutrition meaning like organ meat and cartilage, and like the parts, the bits,
nose
of the
to the toes. Yep.
The deep nutrition plus a ketogenic diet, which we will get to, but not quite yet. We're gonna pause on that, because I have one question before, because that one could be the rest of the show. I want to ask, because I was thinking about this, and then I happened to stumble upon it in your book. I think someone had asked me, if you ever got cancer, would you ever get chemotherapy? And my answer was always no. I do mistletoe.
Oh,
And I
wow.
learned about mistletoe through Suzanne Summers' book.
Awesome.
And and since then, and it's been at least 10 or 12 years since I read that and I understood that. And I've never really thought
Wow.
about it since. And so all of a sudden, I don't know where that came into my mind. And I'm now reading your book and I see mistletoe. I'm like, whoa, we're going to talk about mistletoe.
Yes.
So please talk about mistletoe.
Well, I think it's perfect timing, JJ, to talk about mistletoe because this is its 100th year birthday as a cancer therapy. So, it's actually been around forever. There's over 3,000 species around the world. We started talking about, you can go back to the old mythologies and read about the use of mistletoe for all these other therapies. Hippocrates used it for spleen conditions. And of course, in that Chinese medicine, that's about nourishment and, a taking in of information and digesting it and transmitting it wherever it needs to go. So very powerful there. But about 100 years, well, just over 100 years ago, this crazy guy, Rudolf Steiner, good old Rudy, and Ita Wegman, an oncologist of the time, keen observers of nature and looking at this plant and looking at it going, wow, it looks like a tumor growing in a tree. Okay, so it's a semi-parasitic plant that grows within these trees that looks like a tumor. If you see them everywhere, which you will now that your listeners have heard this, they'll start to see mistletoe everywhere. But there happens to be a type of mistletoe that grows in the Black Forest region of Europe. So that's Austria, France, Switzerland, Germany, that has a particular terroir that has something in the soil, which I love that component as well, is nourishing the type of lectins, polysaccharides, and viscotoxins into this plant material that makes it very relational to cancer. Okay, so they started using it 100 years ago as an injectable. This is what's so crazy to me, for cancer. And somehow, without any of the studies we have today, they understood that if you took this orally, those lectins and those polysaccharides get broken down by the acidity of our digestive tract, that it breaks it down and it still has other benefits for other things, but it doesn't have the anti-cancer component unless you bypass the gut and you move into it going into the B cell level of the body, which is in that subcutaneous level of the tissue, or you bypass that altogether and go into the vein and use this to stimulate an immunomodulating effect. And in that immunomodulating effect, it also lowers inflammation, it lowers angiogenesis, it increases the natural killer cells and the T cells and the B cell immune response. It improves upon the bone marrow, so it is a beautiful therapy to use with standard of care. It also really enhances quality of life. So people's overall sense of well-being improves on this medicine, probably because we think it has an impact on the endorphin system and the endocannabinoid system to upregulate it, which of course is going to make us feel better. Where it has been used for 100 years and what it's most known for is its application with standard of care therapies like radiation, like chemo. And so that's where it has enhanced those outcomes, helped the patient deal with the side effects, and helped them stay healthy and strong through the process and clean them up after the treatment is over. So if you're diagnosed with cancer in Germany, you have about an 85% chance of using this therapy at some point, at some time during your cancer journey. The rest of Europe, about 65% of the time. It's almost unheard of in the United States, though. I'm part of an organization that has helped fund a clinical trial at Hopkins, now into its third year, doing really well, expecting to move into phase, actually probably bypass phase 2 and move right into phase 3, but COVID's put a little hold on this. But there's over 2,500 clinical trials worldwide in the last, dozens and dozens of years. And it's still the most studied and the most utilized integrative cancer therapy out there. Do I use it as a standalone treatment for cancer? No, I do not. I layer it with other things, be it standard of care therapies, be it other integrative therapies like IVC or deep nutrition or hyperbaric oxygen or hyperthermia or whatever is appropriate for the patient based on their data, if you will. That's how we use it. But it is a very powerful therapy. And we have a book coming out on it at the end of the year with 4 other experts in mistletoe around the world who have had some of the people contributing to this book have been using it for over 40 years. So it's exciting to get the stories, the history, where it is in the research right now, where we think it's going in the future, and pretty timely given that it's our lovely 100-year birthday party for this amazing plant medicine.
Well, I'd love to do an entire show on it.
Cool.
And
let's do it.
So when your book comes out, please put me on the list.
Yes.
And let's schedule a time to well, I got to read it first, but read
We'll
most
do
of
that.
it. But we'll definitely do another show around
Cool.
mistletoe, because I do think that it is, again, it's so funny with when I started out in functional medicine with Jeannie and Dr. Allen, and, you know, learning about bioidentical hormones and the fact that, you know, 10 years ago, it had been 75 years since bioidentical hormones had been used in Europe. And here people are freaking out about if they're safe. And I'm like, oh my God, do you not understand that the hormones we're talking about are synthetic? We're talking about bioidentical. And this isn't a new thing. It's been used for 75 years at that point, which was 10 years ago. In Europe very successfully. So, you know, again, it really speaks to the world we're in right now to really show how many of us live from fear of the unknown. And it doesn't matter if the things that we do know that make no logical sense, you know, the fact that tobacco and cigarettes are legal, and that's okay.
Right.
But then when we look at other things that are helpful, and they're just new, and we hold up our hands and we say, no, I don't want to do that. I don't, that's weird. I don't know what that is. Well, learn a little. And right, like, you didn't know what the other thing was, but just because 20 people did it doesn't mean it's any good for you, or that it's the best choice for you. So I love the very personalized plan and program that you make for people that I know also. And the one thing we really haven't talked that much about a little bit, but I want to get into a little bit of epigenetics and the ketogenic and deep nutrition perspective. I know we don't have like a ton more time, so obviously you're going to come back, but let's wrap that in a nice bow for people, because the epigenetic conversation for me right now is huge. I know that you took a look at my interview with Dr. Bruce Lipton, and there's still so many people that literally refuse. They refuse to hear that your quantum physics, that your epigenetics rules everything. And they just want to stay in this fear-based place, looking at these numbers and flattening the curve and what the CDC says. And it's like, oh my God, if you actually understood these sciences, it would put to rest the need to try to find more fear-based things to cling on to. So you literally have a whole section called like the real deal, almost, about like healing. And it isn't, guys, the medicine. It isn't even the food. It starts with the epigenetics. So let's talk about that.
Well, and I think to kind of preempt this, because I know we don't have much time, what I want people to remember is the work of Dr. Kelly Turner. I don't know if you've had her on your show, but she is a sociology researcher who worked in a cancer center that was hearing stories about these quote unquote spontaneous remissions. And she was curious and would ask some of the doctors, and they're like, oh yeah, they happen, but everyone kind of poo-pooed them and moved on. Well, she kept hearing about them more and more and got curious herself. Probably also has some, Aquarius or something in there, but started to look down the rabbit hole and started to look and found 1,000 documented cases of quote unquote spontaneous remission. She took the next decade to follow up with these people in these cases to find out what their common denominators were. At the end of this journey, culminated in the book called Radical Remission, which shows the 9 main factors of these quote unquote spontaneous remission people. But she really realized it's not spontaneous, it's radical. It is a radical shift. And so I was actually one of her stories, 2016, September 2016 on her website. My story is one of her radical remission stories. She's since cataloged tens of thousands of these, right? Not just the 1,000 that her first book came from. She actually has a second book out called Radical Hope. But what I want to point out here is that the 9 main areas to focus on, 2 of them are tangible: supplements and diet. The other 7 of the common denominator of these folks who were radical remission thrivers had nothing to do with the physical realm. No treatment, no pill, no supplement, no drug. It was all on the mental, emotional, spiritual realm. And that is exactly what you're speaking to. And even though she was like on her own doing this work without knowing anything about the people like Candace Pert or Bruce Lipton, or the researchers on extracellular matrix chemistry, like the famous oncology researcher Mina Bissell, who started realizing, wow, it's not the tumor cell, it's what the tumor cell is floating in that's creating the signaling and the pathways. This is what started changing everyone's understanding, like mine and like Kelly's and like Bruce and all these other folks, to say, wow, we're really barking up the wrong tree here, folks. We have a lot more power than we are taught to believe, than we are led to believe. And when we can break ourselves free and escape that sandbox and see what else is out there in the great big world, the opportunities are endless. And that is where we can use thought, we can use diet, we can use even drugs and supplements and other things to change epigenetic expression in a very profound way.
Okay, here's what I want to do. Will you come back to do just a show on the deep nutrition ketogenic part?
I sure will. You bring me in whenever you want.
Okay. So then we have 2 shows coming. One's going to be on the deep nutrition ketogenic from a vegan, right? So
Perfect.
someone who wasn't. I'm going to talk about the role of diet in cancer.
Sure.
I mean, your whole book is called The Metabolic Approach. So
Exactly.
so it's about really mostly about the diet, but I know we've talked about mistletoe, we've talked about the alkaline and acid and understanding that, and a little bit we've covered here about epigenetics. So obviously I have a few people that I know do have cancer in my community and have reached out for all kinds of information. And I didn't have your book at the time to recommend that. So I definitely would love to tell everybody now, if you haven't guessed by now, because today's show, The Metabolic Approach to Cancer, please get that book by Dr. Nasha Winters. And you can get it on Amazon. And where else can you tell them to go? Where can we send them for anything else?
Perfect. So you guys can stalk me at Dr. Nasha Winters for Instagram. Also Dr. Nasha Inc. INC on Facebook, and then also the Metabolic Approach to Cancer on Facebook. Those are the places to follow me. If you want to go to my website, drnasha.com, drnasha.com, there are hundreds and hundreds of hours of free content, of videos and, interviews and write-ups that I've done. I also do a monthly newsletter to bring people up to speed on what's going on out in the world of research, out in the world of thriving, out in the world of applying these terrain-centric concepts to your every single day, as well as my favorite kind of book reads and other, things that really have changed and inspired my own life. So I want people to have that. Plus on the website, we have a little a free little download of 5 steps, if you're diagnosed with cancer, whether it's your first rodeo or a second time around, really ways to think about this differently, more holistically. And that's where my mission now is to change this paradigm, that it doesn't have to be a death sentence. I'm someone living proof of that nearly 30 years later with cancer, though it hasn't been cancer-ring in a very long time, a good decade or so. And so that's a concept that will also throw people off, and we go into that a little bit in the book as well. But we can definitely dive into that on future conversations around more specifics around the foundation of the diet, as well as the mistletoe and the mistletoe's impact on the immune system, but also on the psychosocial aspect of the well-being. The anthroposophical doctors believe that mistletoe basically came here to restore balance, to restore rhythm in our bodies.
So the mistletoe will be the 3rd show. The second show we're going to spend on the really more of the metabolic approach, basically what your book is about. What I want to finish up with today is that I saw that there was a section in the book about the cancer personality traits of people who get cancer. And being a double air sign that you are, and you do have water and you're rising, and I don't know where the rest of it falls, but air being very much in the head, very much about ideas, which sometimes can mean you're not actually in your feelings, and that there's a disconnection from the feelings, and that there's not an expression because you're just in your head. Usually air signs have a lot of anxiety because they're thinking so much, and they're again disconnected from their body. So what I want to know from you, because this epigenetic understanding and idea was probably wow, this is great. I understand it. I resonate with it. I believe it. I'm studying it. Now, what was your application? What did you do to connect your head to your heart and your body and work on some of the emotional changes and releasing and neurological repatterning? What did you do?
So I will tell this, and I don't often share this, so I'm kind of sharing a piece of my story with your listeners in a way that really wasn't safe to share until the last couple of years, but one of the most transformational experiences that helped me really root into my body and connect with God in a way that I'd never quite connected with, and really understand myself on a deeper level and my connection to everything, was a good old nice walloping dose of psilocybin. And so that was early on within the first year of my diagnosis. And I think that was really instrumental because I didn't see any other way out. And I believe that this plant medicine was really instrumental in rewiring my perception and rewiring my ability to look for other opportunities. So it was a very powerful tool for me to break some really ancient rooted patterns that were difficult to do on my own. Now, some people can get there without that. No problem. I think most people can. I was really in a place where I think I would not be here today if I had not had that running start. The other piece is that nature is exactly like, I'm the person, you will see me laying on the earth a lot. You will see me barefoot on the earth a lot. That is a place where nature really, really roots and grounds and soothes my soul. And if I don't get a nature fix every day to some degree, it really does keep me too much in my head. You know, the Ayurvedic doctors would call me very vata deranged at times, of where I can go with this. So it helps root me tremendously. And meditation is the other. Pretty much I have to do that every single day or I'm not a functioning person, because it helps me get quiet and still to really synthesize that information that's spinning around in my head and integrate it, and then be able to share it in a way that's, actionable for myself and for others.
Definitely meditation for you air signs to stop the spinning and to stop the negative momentum and, energy into more of a quieting the mind a little bit, or reducing the speed of momentum that you have going on and bringing it back down for sure. And in terms of plant medicine, it's not the first time I've heard it. Actually, Dr. Eben Alexander was on the show and we talked about that in terms of in its relationship to consciousness. And so it's something that I'm interested in. I have got friends that go to Rhythmia once a year, or they've experienced it. They've done the whole thing down there in Costa Rica where it's, you've got like a shaman for each person or every two people. And you're very, the health aspect is really taken care of. I've never done it, but it's funny that you say that was what it is. Cause I remember an ex-friend of mine who was an air sign, who was real wound tight, just very much so. And is a Gemini. And I remember saying to him, and I do wine and caffeine. That's and sugar, right? Those are my drugs. I've never really smoked pot, maybe like a handful of times in my life, and between the ages of like 22 and 26. I did an edible once over the last year, which was not a good idea for me.
Right. You probably have a CYP2C9 star, which I have, which makes pot make you a psychotic person. So I don't want that paranoia and that psychosis. And some of us are wired that way. So
yeah. Although we'll take it back. I do use some CBD sometimes, but again, that's more for the health benefits of CBD. But I told this friend, I said, cause he didn't drink, he didn't do anything. And I said, look, I do not normally recommend drugs, but you smoking pot, you might just want to try it once just to understand where to go to.
Interesting.
Like to put yourself in a different state, because you don't know any differently, just to open yourself up to, here's what it would be like to slow my brain down.
Yeah.
And then you work at lifestyle changes to get there through meditation, through grounding. I've had Clint Ober on the show and Meryl Hemingway to represent earthing. So we're big earthing people on this show. And, and I need it more. I try to do it as much as possible, but it is so healing. Yeah. And again, there's just so much to cover. I knew once I started reading the book that I was going to have enough to fill this hour. And I, obviously at the beginning realized I have enough to fill a week. So we're going to start with the next show. And the next show is going to dive a little bit deeper into the deep nutrition and ketogenic diet when it comes to the metabolic approach to cancer, and why we're taking this food-based approach in terms of true healing and changing. We'll talk about sugar. We'll talk about whatever else that you think is some of the myths and the deeper understandings of how we have so much more control. Besides epigenetics, we have so much more control over how we change the chemistry of our body and the biochemistry to help induce healing faster, and how to prevent possibly it ever happening in the first place. And also by that point, I think I do want to go over on that next show the personality traits of people who get cancer, because I have a listener who was a part of a group and they had cancer and they got over the cancer and they celebrated they're getting over their cancer. And through this pandemic, I have seen all of the traits that brought on the cancer in the first place. And it's like, I'm not saying anything because I don't want to like reach out and say something to somebody, but it's almost like if you're not careful, you're going to get it back because you didn't actually address the reason why you manifested it in the first place, which was the constant worry, people pleasing, over giving, exhaustive rescuer, but at the same time, martyr, right?
Yeah. And that's like, you cannot heal from the soil in which you got sick. simply put. And so if people return back, because I hear people say all the time, I just want to go back to the way it was. Guess what? That's what got you here. So please don't ever think in those terms. Yeah.
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 So it's
cool.
So Dr. Nasha is DRNA.
Yeah.
It looks like Nasha. DRNASHA.com. And did you want to talk about the Believe Big Institute?
Oh yeah, just a quick, maybe we can touch on that more later, but I would love for people to go and Google Believe Big Institute of Health, which is a nearly 3-decade dream starting to come to fruition of the first and only integrative metabolic forward residential hospital research institute in the United States. And so the best vetted therapies from standard of care to integrative care all under one roof with a variety of ways to pay for it, be it health grants, be it philanthropic, be it insurance, be it cash-based. So basically it opens itself and lends itself to being available to everybody, not just those with means. And we're very excited. We're now working on our capital campaign, starting on our big fundraising aspects of it, but you'll get a little video taste, you'll get a little one-pager taste of what we're up to. And we're definitely looking for strategic partners and capital to help make this happen. So if you want to have any listeners who have a couple $1 million lying around, they want to throw into changing, creating basically a legacy of changing cancer as we know it, I'd love to talk to them.
So Believe Big Institute of Health. The
Yes.
link will be in the show notes for those
Thank
of you
you.
that know where the show notes are. So make sure, and if you don't know where the show notes are, then you can Google Believe Big Institute of Health. And that's fabulous. And we'll definitely talk about that a little bit more on the next show because she
Great.
will be back.
Whoosh.
Dr. Nasha, thank you so much. It's been amazing. And I can't wait to talk to you again.
Absolutely. What a joy, JJ. Thank you. And thank you to all your listeners for tuning in.